Snow drifted against the towering windows of Blackthorne Manor while 100 candles burned beneath crystal chandeliers, turning the ballroom into a glittering illusion of warmth. Silk gowns swept across polished marble floors like restless waves beneath moonlight, and the scent of roses, beeswax, and expensive perfume lingered heavily in the air. Beyond the musicians' platform, London's highest families gathered in jeweled clusters, exchanging pleasantries sharpened by cruelty. Every smile concealed a judgment. Every fan lifted before painted lips carried another whisper into the room. At the foot of the grand staircase stood Lady Eleanor Whitmore, motionless amid the splendor, her silver gown shimmering like frost beneath the candlelight. She possessed the delicate beauty society admired in portraits yet punished in living women: thoughtful gray eyes, graceful posture, and a face too honest to disguise sorrow. Though only 23, she already carried herself with the weary caution of someone long acquainted with humiliation. Her gloved hands remained calmly folded before her, yet the faint tension within her shoulders betrayed the effort required simply to remain standing beneath the scrutiny surrounding her. "She was fortunate the Duke married her at all," murmured one countess behind a feathered fan. "Fortunate?" another replied softly. "Her father died disgraced. One hears there were debts, forged signatures, even treasonous dealings. And still she dares appear here adorned in silver." The women lowered their eyes as Eleanor glanced toward them, but their silence carried greater insult than open mockery. Across the ballroom, gentlemen observed her with restrained fascination, as though she were both scandal and entertainment wrapped in silk. The orchestra continued its waltz without mercy. In Victorian society, disgrace did not merely stain a person's name. It transformed them into spectacle. At the far end of the hall stood Sebastian Whitmore, Duke of Blackthorne. Tall and severe in black evening attire, he seemed carved from the very austerity of the manor itself. Silver candlelight touched the sharp angles of his face without softening them. Though dozens sought his attention, he listened to none for long. His reputation moved through London with almost mythic force. Brilliant in Parliament, merciless in negotiation, impossible to truly know. Men respected him carefully. Women admired him from a distance. Servants lowered their voices when speaking his name. Yet tonight his gaze lingered nowhere except the ballroom doors, as though waiting for the evening to end. Eleanor watched him quietly from across the room. She remembered the strange stillness of their wedding day 6 months earlier, when he had lifted her veil without tenderness or cruelty, studying her as though fulfilling an obligation decided long before either of them entered the chapel. Since then he had remained impeccably courteous, yet distant enough to make loneliness echo through every corridor of Blackthorne Manor. He never insulted her directly. Somehow that restraint wounded more deeply. When the musicians began another waltz, several ladies accepted eager partners while Eleanor remained untouched beside the staircase. No gentleman approached the Duchess, whose presence unsettled polite society. At last, swallowing the last remnants of pride, she crossed the ballroom toward her husband. Conversations dimmed as she approached him. "Your Grace," she said gently, "might I request this dance?" Sebastian looked down at her with unreadable eyes. For one suspended moment she believed he might accept. Then his gaze shifted briefly toward the watching guests surrounding them. "A lady survives society's judgment," he said quietly, "by remaining unseen." The words struck harder because of their softness. A silence spread outward through the ballroom like ink through water. Eleanor felt heat rise painfully beneath her skin while nearby aristocrats lowered their eyes with feigned sympathy. Sebastian offered neither apology nor explanation. He merely inclined his head and turned away to address an elderly lord waiting beside him. In that instant Eleanor understood something terrible. Her husband did not merely fear scandal. He feared being seen beside her. She withdrew before anyone could witness the trembling beginning in her hands. The orchestra resumed playing, though the music now sounded distant and brittle, like glass threatening to crack. She moved through the ballroom with measured grace until she reached the terrace doors overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Cold air swept against her cheeks as she stepped outside alone. Beyond the balustrade, winter stretched across the grounds in silver silence. Carriage lanterns flickered near the gates while bare trees clawed at the darkened sky. Eleanor pressed one hand against the frozen stone railing and closed her eyes briefly, willing herself not to cry. She had endured whispers before. Since her father's death, humiliation had become as familiar as breathing. Yet Sebastian's rejection pierced deeper because some foolish hidden part of her had still hoped for kindness. A memory surfaced uninvited. Her mother once telling her that dignity was not the absence of pain, but the decision to carry pain beautifully. Eleanor straightened slowly beneath the snowfall, gathering the shattered remains of composure around herself like another layer of silk. Hours later, after the final guest departed and Blackthorne Manor descended into exhausted silence, Eleanor wandered the western corridor unable to sleep. Moonlight stretched pale across the carpet while distant fireplaces crackled behind closed doors. Most of the manor remained unfamiliar to her even now, as though the house itself resisted her presence. Then she noticed a narrow line of golden light beneath a door usually kept locked. The Duke's private library stood slightly open. Heart pounding softly, Eleanor approached through the silence and pushed the door wider. Shelves of leather-bound books rose into darkness around a dying fire. Papers covered the great mahogany desk near the windows. Upon its polished surface rested a single ivory letter sealed with dark red wax. Her breath caught. Written across the front in unmistakable black ink were the words, Lady Eleanor Ashcombe. The name she had not borne since her wedding seemed to glow beneath the firelight like a ghost returned from burial, and somewhere within the silent manor, floorboards creaked warning her she was longer alone. The creak upon the corridor floorboards grew nearer while Eleanor stood frozen beside the Duke's desk, the ivory letter trembling faintly within her grasp. Firelight painted shadows across towering shelves lined with histories, law books, and forgotten journals. For a reckless heartbeat she considered breaking the seal immediately, yet instinct warned her the contents possessed danger greater than ordinary scandal. The name written upon the envelope belonged to the woman she had once been before disgrace and marriage buried her beneath another identity. The library door opened fully behind her. Sebastian Whitmore entered without haste, though surprise flickered briefly across his disciplined expression when he saw the letter in her hands. Snow clung to the shoulders of his dark coat, and cold night air followed him into the room. Neither spoke at first. Eleanor lifted her eyes toward him steadily despite the unease tightening her chest. "Why is my maiden name hidden among your private papers?" Sebastian closed the door. "Because some matters are safer hidden. That letter concerns my family." "Yes." The single word sharpened the tension already coiling through the room. Eleanor noticed then that the Duke looked exhausted, as though sleep had abandoned him long before she entered the library. A thin line of strain shadowed his mouth, and for the first time since their marriage he seemed less untouchable nobleman than burdened man. She gathered courage and broke the seal. Sebastian crossed the room, his gloved hand closing around her wrist before she could unfold the pages. The sudden contact startled them both. "Do not," he said quietly. "I deserve the truth." His gaze lowered briefly toward the visible fragments of ink already exposed beneath the candlelight. Eleanor managed to read only scattered phrases before he drew the letter away from her trembling fingers. Financial accusations. False witnesses. Ashcombe inquiry. The words struck her like fragments of shattered glass. "My father was innocent, was he not?" she whispered. Sebastian stared into the fire rather than at her. "Some truths do not merely ruin reputations, Lady Whitmore. They bury entire bloodlines." The answer unsettled her more deeply than outright refusal. Before she could question him further, he folded the letter carefully and locked it inside a carved mahogany drawer. "You should rest," he murmured. "And you should cease speaking to me as though I am a stranger wandering your halls." A shadow crossed his expression then vanished almost immediately. He bowed his head slightly before leaving the library without another word. The following morning Blackthorne Manor seemed transformed by peculiar gentleness. Beside Eleanor's breakfast tray rested a vase of fresh white roses dusted with winter water. No card accompanied them. Mrs. Weatherby, the elderly housekeeper, claimed ignorance regarding the flowers. The servants offered polite silence. By evening a rare volume of poetry appeared upon the sitting-room table near Eleanor's embroidery frame. Inside she discovered verses marked lightly beside passages describing loneliness, duty, and impossible devotion. 3 nights later, while dining alone beneath the painted ceilings of the manor, musicians hidden somewhere beyond the gallery began playing her late mother's favorite melody upon the pianoforte. Eleanor lowered her fork slowly. No one living beyond her family had known that song mattered to her. The realization followed her through the silent corridors afterward like invisible footsteps. Blackthorne Manor no longer felt merely cold. It felt watchful. Yet Sebastian himself remained distant. During meals he spoke only when necessary. At social engagements he offered formal courtesies without warmth. His restraint confused her now because hidden kindness had begun appearing everywhere around her like secret candle flames. Several days later London society gathered for a winter charity exhibition hosted within the conservatory of Lady Haverfield's estate. Glass lanterns illuminated exotic flowers beneath the iron-domed ceiling while snow drifted softly beyond the panes overhead. Eleanor arrived beside Sebastian in deep green velvet, aware of every curious glance following them through the crowd. At first the evening passed peacefully. Then Lady Beatrice Carlyle approached surrounded by jeweled companions whose smiles resembled sharpened knives. "How admirable," Lady Beatrice remarked loudly, studying Eleanor with theatrical pity, "that Blackthorne Manor extends charity beyond orphanages." The surrounding ladies laughed softly. Eleanor felt humiliation burn through her veins, yet years of discipline kept her posture composed. "I fear I do not understand you." "Of course not," Lady Beatrice replied sweetly. "One hears confusion often accompanies uncertain parentage." The insult landed with calculated precision. Nearby conversations faltered as listeners strained toward the unfolding cruelty. Eleanor sensed the familiar collapse of dignity approaching. Then Sebastian stepped forward. The movement itself silenced the room. His expression remained calm, though something dangerous darkened his eyes as he faced Lady Beatrice. "Any person who insults my Duchess," he said evenly, "insults this house itself." The conservatory fell utterly still. Lady Beatrice paled beneath her powder. "Your Grace, I intended no offense." "And yet you delivered one." Sebastian offered nothing further. He merely extended his arm toward Eleanor with authority. For the first time since their marriage, she placed her hand upon him before all of London without feeling abandoned. The carriage ride home passed beneath heavy snowfall and deeper silence. Eleanor watched frost gather along the windows while questions crowded painfully through her thoughts. Why protect her publicly while freezing her privately? Why conceal truths regarding her father? Why fill the manor with anonymouskinnesses he refused to acknowledge aloud? When they arrived at Blackthorne Manor, Sebastian disappeared immediately toward the western wing. Restless and unable to sleep, Eleanor wandered hours later into the small music room overlooking the gardens. Firelight glowed faintly against polished instruments abandoned in darkness. Upon the pianoforte rested the poetry volume she had discovered days earlier. This time a folded note waited inside. Her breath caught as she unfolded the paper. "There are prisons built not of iron," the message read, "but of duty." The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Sebastian. And suddenly Eleanor understood that the coldest man within Blackthorne Manor had been speaking to her all along. Winter settled heavily upon Blackthorne Manor after the charity exhibition, cloaking the estate in endless fog and silver frost. Days passed beneath low gray skies while Eleanor carried Sebastian's handwritten words within her thoughts like a secret wound that refused to heal. "There are prisons built not of iron, but of duty." The sentence lingered in every corridor she crossed, transforming the Duke's coldness into something more dangerous than indifference. It suggested suffering. It suggested sacrifice. Worst of all, it suggested feeling. Yet Sebastian continued avoiding intimacy with almost painful precision. At breakfast he discussed estate accounts while never lifting his eyes fully toward her. During dinner he spoke of Parliament and trade disputes while servants moved quietly between them beneath candlelight. Sometimes Eleanor caught him watching her from across a room, his expression shadowed by thoughts he never permitted himself to voice. Whenever their gazes met directly, he withdrew behind composure once more. The distance no longer felt cruel alone. It felt deliberate. One storm-darkened afternoon Eleanor entered the West Corridor Library while Sebastian attended meetings in London. Rain rattled against tall windows as she searched through shelves and locked cabinets with growing desperation. The unanswered questions surrounding her father had become unbearable. She remembered too vividly the accusations hurled after his death: fraud, treachery, corruption. Society had condemned him swiftly, and afterward it condemned his daughter merely for carrying his name. Inside a narrow cabinet hidden behind historical volumes, Eleanor discovered a leather portfolio tied with faded ribbon. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded brittle documents filled with signatures, parliamentary seals, and financial records. Several pages contained handwritten corrections beside enormous missing sums. Others bore the names of influential aristocrats she recognized instantly from London society. One signature appeared repeatedly: Lord Edmund Barrington. Eleanor's breath faltered. Barrington had been among her father's closest political allies before the scandal destroyed the Ashcombe family. Yet here his name appeared beside suspicious transfers and altered figures carefully concealed beneath official endorsements. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned sharply, expecting servants, but Sebastian stood in the doorway drenched from rain, his dark gloves still clenched tightly in one hand. Water glimmered along the edges of his coat while stormlight sharpened the strain within his face. "You should not have found those," he said quietly. You knew, Eleanor whispered. All this time, you knew my father was innocent. The silence that followed seemed to swallow even the storm itself. Sebastian closed the library door slowly. Your father trusted the wrong men. Barrington and his associates falsified records to conceal their own thefts from Parliament. When suspicion arose, they required another name to sacrifice. And my father became convenient. Yes. The word shattered something inside her. Eleanor turned away abruptly, gripping the desk for balance while grief surged through her chest with renewed violence. Years of humiliation suddenly transformed into something far crueler because innocence had existed beneath it all. Her father had died disgraced for another man's crimes while society applauded the destruction. Why conceal this from me? She demanded, her voice trembling despite herself. Sebastian removed his gloves slowly. Because exposing Barrington would implicate families still intertwined with the crown and Parliament. Including mine. Eleanor stared at him. My father once protected Barrington politically, Sebastian continued. When evidence surfaced against him years later, silence became preferable to scandal. Powerful men preserve themselves before they preserve justice. And you? She asked bitterly. What did you preserve by marrying me? For the first time since entering the room, genuine pain crossed his expression openly. You. The answer silenced her. Sebastian moved toward the fire, though exhaustion waited every step. After your father died, creditors descended upon Ashcombe House within days. Society had already condemned you. Marriage to me offered protection no one else could provide. Protection. Eleanor's eyes glistened with restrained fury. You locked me inside a gilded prison and called it salvation. His jaw tightened. I believed distance would spare you. From what? From becoming attached to a cursed name. The confession hung heavily between them. Eleanor suddenly saw beyond the Duke's rigid composure into the weary guilt beneath it. Every cruel silence, every measured distance, every restrained glance had not been born from hatred alone. They had been constructed deliberately, like walls built by a man terrified his own life might destroy hers. Rain thundered harder against the windows while firelight flickered across Sebastian's face. You think yourself dangerous, Eleanor murmured softly. I know precisely what this family has buried. His voice roughened unexpectedly. Do you imagine it easy watching them whisper about you? Hearing your name spoken with contempt while I stand beside men responsible for your suffering? Every kindness I offered became another risk. Every moment near you weakened decisions I once believed necessary. Eleanor's heartbeat quickened painfully. For months she had imagined herself unloved. Now she confronted something infinitely more complicated. A man denying his own feelings because guilt convinced him affection itself would become another cruelty. The storm dimmed suddenly as evening shadows crept through the library. Neither moved. At last Eleanor stepped closer. Only inches separated them now. She noticed the faint tremor in Sebastian's breathing, the exhaustion lining his eyes, the unbearable restraint with which he held himself apart from her even now. You are not your father, she whispered. A silence followed so intimate it frightened them both. Sebastian lifted one hand slowly, as though uncertain whether touching her might shatter the fragile honesty unfolding between them. His fingers brushed lightly against her wrist where her pulse fluttered beneath pale skin. The contact carried more tenderness than any embrace. I have wanted, he confessed quietly, to tell you the truth 1,000 times. Then why didn't you? Because once spoken aloud, there would be no returning to distance. Eleanor felt tears threaten unexpectedly, not from sorrow alone but from the terrible longing hidden beneath his words. She realized then that the loneliness haunting Blackthorne Manor belonged not only to her. Sebastian had imprisoned himself within it long before she arrived. He crossed toward the locked desk drawer and removed the ivory letter once more. There are matters within these pages you still deserve to know. Before he could hand it to her, urgent knocking shattered the silence. A servant entered breathlessly, pale with alarm. Your Grace, he stammered, forgive the intrusion, but someone has broken into the records chamber. Sebastian straightened instantly. What was taken? The servant swallowed hard. The original documents concerning the Ashcombe investigation, sir. And this evening London newspapers received anonymous notice that Lady Whitmore's disgrace will soon be discussed publicly before Parliament. News of the stolen documents spread through London with merciless speed. By morning, newspapers carried elegant columns dripping with implication rather than proof, each sentence crafted carefully enough to avoid accusation while ensuring scandal flourished in every drawing room across the city. Ladies paused mid-conversation when Eleanor entered boutiques or chapels. Gentlemen lowered their voices when Sebastian passed through Parliament. The Ashcombe disgrace, once fading into memory, had returned sharpened into fresh entertainment for a society starving for ruin. Blackthorne Manor grew tense beneath the pressure. Servants moved quietly through corridors as though fearful loud footsteps might fracture the fragile calm holding the household together outside. Winter storms battered the estate relentlessly, but inside another storm gathered between duty and truth. Eleanor stood one evening beside the library windows watching snow descend across the gardens in silver curtains. Behind her, Sebastian sat at his desk surrounded by correspondence from political allies urging silence. Some advised temporary exile from London until rumors settled. Others demanded he distance himself publicly from his wife before Parliament convened. Sebastian burned each letter unread after the first lines. The flames illuminated his face with restless gold while Eleanor studied him silently. She no longer saw only the cold duke feared by society. She saw the man exhausted by years of carrying secrets powerful enough to destroy generations. "You may still escape this," she said quietly without turning from the window. "If you allow them to condemn me alone, your title remains untouched." Sebastian's voice came low behind her. "Do not ask me to become the sort of man I already despise. You could lose everything." At that he rose from the desk. Eleanor sensed him approach before his reflection appeared faintly beside hers in the darkened glass. Snow light softened the severity of his features, yet determination burned unmistakably within his eyes. "I nearly lost myself long before I risked losing a title," he murmured. "There is a difference." The honesty in his voice unsettled her more deeply than tenderness might have done. For months they had existed like strangers bound by obligation. Now every glance between them carried dangerous intimacy. The following evening London's political elite gathered at Harrington Hall for the annual parliamentary banquet, an event famous less for celebration than for whispered negotiations shaping the nation's future. Crystal chandeliers illuminated endless rows of aristocrats draped in velvet, diamonds, and polished authority. Servants glided through the hall carrying silver trays while musicians played softly beneath the hum of cultivated conversation. When Sebastian and Eleanor entered together, silence rippled almost imperceptibly through the room. Women observed Eleanor with veiled fascination, expecting humiliation to collapse upon her before the evening ended. Men watched Sebastian with careful calculation, waiting to discover whether the Duke of Blackthorne intended to protect his wife or abandon her publicly to preserve himself. Eleanor felt every stare like pressure against her skin, yet she walked beside Sebastian without faltering. Her silver gown shimmered beneath candlelight like armor forged from winter itself. For the first time since her marriage she no longer wished to disappear. At the far end of the banquet hall stood Lord Edmund Barrington. Age had silvered his hair but not softened the arrogance settled permanently across his features. He greeted fellow politicians with effortless charm while pretending not to notice Eleanor's arrival. Yet satisfaction lingered within his eyes, as though he already anticipated her destruction. Dinner progressed beneath suffocating tension. Conversations drifted toward corruption scandals and parliamentary investigations with deliberate cruelty. Several guests glanced openly toward Eleanor whenever accusations involving forged records arose. The trap tightening around her had become visible to everyone present. Then Lord Barrington rose slowly from his chair. "My friends," he announced smoothly, lifting a crystal glass, "recent rumors have unfortunately reopened painful discussions regarding the late Lord Ashcombe. One regrets that certain disgraces continue haunting respectable institutions even after so many years." The hall quieted instantly. Eleanor felt humiliation surge through her chest, but before Barrington could continue, Sebastian stood. The movement alone commanded the room. He placed one gloved hand upon the table with measured calm while his gaze fixed upon Barrington like sharpened steel. "That if Lady Whitmore is to be judged tonight," he said evenly, "then London may judge me first." Whispers erupted immediately. Barrington's expression tightened. "Your Grace, surely this is unnecessary." "No," Sebastian replied, "what has been unnecessary is years of silence protecting cowards." Every eye in the hall remained fixed upon him now. Sebastian reached inside his coat and withdrew several folded papers. The investigation against Lord Ashcombe was fabricated through falsified financial records orchestrated by men seated within this very room. My own family aided their concealment to avoid political catastrophe. Shock spread visibly across the banquet tables. Barrington stepped forward angrily. "You possess no proof." "I possess enough." Sebastian's voice hardened. "And if further evidence is required, I will surrender every private record belonging to Blackthorne Estates for public examination before Parliament." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Such an act would expose generations of political dealings and potentially destroy the Whitmore name forever. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. He was sacrificing everything. Barrington's composure finally cracked. You would ruin your own bloodline for this woman. Sebastian turned toward Eleanor then, and the entire hall seemed to vanish beneath the weight of his gaze. For my wife, he answered quietly, I would ruin far more than that. The words struck Eleanor with devastating force. Not because they were dramatic but because they were true. Barrington attempted another protest, yet Sebastian silenced him by presenting documents bearing corrected ledgers and witness signatures long concealed from public record. Several influential guests began murmuring anxiously among themselves as realization spread through the room. The scandal was no longer Eleanor's shame alone. It had become evidence of corruption reaching deep into Parliament itself. 4 years society had treated Eleanor as something tainted. Now the men who destroyed her family stood exposed beneath the same merciless scrutiny they once directed toward her. A terrible stillness settled across the hall. Then Eleanor rose slowly beside her husband. Every gaze shifted toward her once more, but this time she felt no urge to lower her eyes. She had spent years surviving whispers. Tonight she would finally answer them. A woman's silence, she said clearly, is often mistaken for weakness. In truth, it is merely the cost of being unheard. No one interrupted her. I carried disgrace that never belonged to me because powerful men required a convenient sacrifice. Yet the cruelest wound was not society's judgment. It was watching honorable people remain silent rather than challenge it. Her gaze moved briefly toward Sebastian. And sometimes courage arrives too late, she continued softly, but late courage remains courage nonetheless. Emotion flickered visibly across Sebastian's face before discipline reclaimed it. Without another word, he extended his hand toward her before the entire hall. This time Eleanor accepted immediately. Together they walked through the stunned silence of London's highest society while snow swirled beyond the towering windows like ash carried through the night. No applause followed them. No farewell was offered. The room remained frozen beneath the collapse of secrets years in the making. Outside, freezing rain lashed against their carriage as they departed Harrington Hall. Eleanor's pulse still raced violently while the city blurred beyond misted glass. Across from her, Sebastian sat in exhausted silence, his knuckles pale where his gloves remained clenched. You have destroyed your future, she whispered. He looked at her steadily through the dim lantern light. No, he said quietly. Tonight I finally chose it. Rain battered the carriage windows as Blackthorne Manor emerged through darkness like a great wounded creature waiting beneath the storm. Lanterns flickered beside the iron gates while servants hurried across the front steps to receive the Duke and Duchess. Yet despite the chaos surrounding the estate after the scandal at Harrington Hall, Eleanor sensed something had shifted irreversibly between herself and Sebastian during the journey home. The silence separating them no longer felt cold. It felt fragile, almost sacred, as though both feared speaking too soon might shatter whatever truth had finally awakened between them. Inside the manor, exhausted servants avoided direct conversation regarding the evening's events, though alarm traveled visibly through the household. Word of Sebastian's public accusation against Parliament had already begun spreading through London. By dawn the newspapers would transform the Duke's confession into national scandal. As Eleanor removed her gloves near the grand staircase, the elderly butler approached carrying a small wooden box sealed with dark blue wax. This arrived shortly before midnight, Your Grace, he said carefully. The messenger insisted it be delivered only into Lady Whitmore's hands. Eleanor accepted the box slowly. Something about the faded ribbon surrounding it struck her immediately with painful familiarity. Her breath caught as she recognized the delicate stitching sewn into one corner of the cloth beneath the wax seal. Her mother's embroidery. For a moment the world seemed to narrow into silence around her. Sebastian noticed the sudden change in her expression and stepped closer without speaking. Together they entered the library, where firelight flickered across endless shelves and shadows trembled against the ceiling. The same room where everything had begun. Eleanor lowered herself into the chair beside the hearth while Sebastian remained standing nearby, tense with concern. Her fingers shook as she broke the ancient seal. Inside rested a folded letter yellowed by years of concealment. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to her mother. My dearest Eleanor, if this letter has reached you, then truths long buried have finally risen beyond concealment. I prayed you would never carry the burden of knowing what destroyed our family, yet I fear silence has already wounded you more deeply than honesty ever could. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision almost immediately. She pressed trembling fingertips against her lips before continuing. Your father was innocent. He discovered theft among powerful men who feared exposure more than God himself. When he refused to remain silent, they ruined him before he could ruin them. Yet there was one man within that terrible circle who tried to stop it. Lord Adrian Whitmore. Sebastian stiffened visibly beside the fire. Eleanor continued reading in disbelief. The Duke of Blackthorne learned the accusations against your father were false only days before Parliament moved against him. He attempted to intervene privately, but the men surrounding Barrington threatened political destruction upon the Whitmore family should Adrian speak publicly. Before he could gather proof, he died suddenly after falling from his carriage during a storm outside London. Your father believed his death was no accident. The library fell silent except for the crackling fire. Sebastian turned away sharply, one hand braced against the mantel as though the room itself had shifted beneath him. Eleanor stared at the page through rising emotion. The cruel legacy haunting Blackthorne Manor suddenly revealed itself fully at last. Sebastian had not merely inherited power and silence from his father. He had inherited guilt, suspicion, and fear. Another line captured her attention. Before his death, Lord Adrian swore his son would one day know the truth and protect you if he possessed any honor at all. Eleanor lowered the letter slowly. 4 years Sebastian had carried the sins of men who shaped his childhood. He had believed himself dangerous because the world surrounding him had taught him that love inevitably demanded sacrifice. Every cold silence between them, every painful distance, had grown from terror that history might repeat itself through him. Sebastian remained motionless near the firelight, his expression shadowed by emotion too raw for concealment. My father never spoke of this, he said quietly. After his death, the family destroyed nearly all correspondence connected to Ashcombe inquiries. I believed he protected Barrington willingly. He tried to stop him. Yes. His voice tightened painfully. And perhaps it killed him. Eleanor rose slowly from the chair. For months she had seen Sebastian as cold, distant, impossible to understand. Now she saw something entirely different. A lonely man raised inside generations of corruption and silence, convinced tenderness itself would become another weapon against the people he loved. She crossed the library until only inches separated them. You are not responsible for their sins, she whispered. A bitter smile touched his mouth briefly. That does not prevent inheritance. It prevented nothing because you carried it alone. Sebastian looked at her then with an honesty so vulnerable it almost frightened her. I thought marrying you would repay a debt my family owed yours. I intended to protect you quietly and ask nothing in return. But somewhere along the way, Eleanor murmured, you stopped protecting me out of obligation. His composure faltered completely at that. Yes. The single word contained months of restrained feeling, sleepless nights, and unspoken longing. Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken beneath the unbearable weight of everything they had almost lost through silence. Sebastian stepped closer carefully, as though uncertain he deserved nearness even now. You were never meant to become part of this darkness, he confessed. Every cruel distance between us was born from fear that loving you would destroy you further. Emotion rose painfully within Eleanor's chest. And yet your silence nearly did. He closed his eyes briefly, wounded by the truth of it. When he spoke again, his voice carried none of the cold authority feared by Parliament or society. It carried only exhaustion and sincerity. You were never the shame hidden within this house, Eleanor. You were the only honest thing left inside it. The words shattered the final barrier between them. Eleanor reached for him first. Sebastian drew her into his arms with restrained desperation, as though holding something precious after years believing himself unworthy of possessing it. The embrace carried grief, relief, apology, and love all at once. Firelight danced across the library walls while winter rain hammered the windows beyond, yet within that moment Blackthorne Manor no longer felt haunted by silence. It felt alive. Days later, London erupted into chaos as Parliament launched formal investigations against Barrington and several influential families implicated in the forged records. Newspapers that once mocked Eleanor now praised her dignity beneath public cruelty. Society shifted its loyalties with embarrassing speed, eager to condemn yesterday's powerful men before they themselves became associated with scandal. Yet neither Eleanor nor Sebastian cared greatly for society's changing affections anymore. Winter gradually loosened its grip upon the countryside. Snow melted from the gardens surrounding Blackthorne Manor while pale spring sunlight entered rooms once shadowed by secrecy. Eleanor reopened the library windows herself one morning, allowing fresh air to move through the place where so many painful truths had remained imprisoned. Sebastian watched quietly from the doorway, and for the first time since their marriage, peace softened his features without restraint. "You have changed this house," he told her. "No," Eleanor replied gently, glancing toward him. "We changed it by refusing to let silence remain master here." Months later, another grand ball filled Blackthorne Manor with music and candlelight. Once again London's aristocracy gathered beneath glittering chandeliers, though the atmosphere differed entirely from the cruel spectacle Eleanor first endured there. Conversations quieted respectfully when she entered the ballroom dressed in ivory silk, no longer carrying herself like a woman awaiting judgment. Across the hall Sebastian stood among diplomats and noblemen, yet the moment he saw her, everything else seemed to disappear from his attention. The orchestra began a waltz. This time Sebastian crossed the ballroom openly before all of society. No hesitation restrained him. No fear shadowed his expression. The guests watched in complete silence as the Duke of Blackthorne stopped before his Duchess and bowed with unmistakable reverence. "May I have this dance, my lady?" Eleanor smiled then, not with fragile politeness but with genuine happiness earned through suffering survived together. She placed her hand in his. "You already have it." As the waltz carried them across the ballroom beneath rivers of golden candlelight, the whispers surrounding them no longer sounded cruel. They sounded distant, powerless, fading into irrelevance beside the simple truth neither society nor scandal had managed to destroy. At last, after years of silence, Blackthorne Manor belonged not to shame, but to love.